Hi, this is Max. I'm going to be talking about a game project I've been working on for the past couple days. And I'm going to start off by showing you all the cool stuff, everything I have so far, and then get into how I made it and my plans for the future. Okay, so what do we got? We've got this. This is Rose. She used to be a person, but she fell into a swamp. Now she's a big monster. Um, she could swim around. Not fully animated yet, obviously, but we're getting there. We got the nice bubble trails. And she's got a couple of attacks. This is going to be a side-scrolling underwater kind of combat thing, though I'm not exactly sure what that entails yet. She also has a heavy attack, which is my favorite. She can do this big, that chains into more attacks. But she can do this big front flip, tail whip thing, and I love it. It looks so cool. Yeah. But yeah, no, that's just me pressing the spacebar over and over to do these different attacks. There's no like, you can't like press, R1 for light attack, R2 for heavy attack, or anything like that. At least not yet. My plans are to also add some kind of upward attack and lower attack, and also animations for each, because this looks silly. But yeah, no, that's everything we've got. I'm going to show you guys this model in a bit more detail as I'm talking about my plans for this game. So, we've got a week. We're on day 2 of the jam, and, I don't exactly have a, what do they call it, MVP, minimal viable product yet. I don't have a prototype. I just have a protagonist, which is an interesting place to be in because, there's a lot of possibility. For good and bad. I could, and I'm hoping to, light upon the right path here and figure out something that is both fun, interesting to do, to work on. It feels rewarding, and I enjoy the narrative and creative aspect of it, while also being, not incredibly out of scope because I have like 5 days. Yeah, I like making her talk when I talk. This is what I look like in real life, by the way. Um, but yeah, so with that in mind, I have a lot of ideas that are kind of floating in the ether right now. Um, and I'm not sure how many of those I'm going to be able to realize. And I'm also not sure how many I want to talk about. I will talk about the game's theme, though, and how this game is going to incorporate it, because, as of right now, nothing about this has anything to do with the theme. This aquatic kind of horror crocodile swamp game has nothing to do with the phrase roll the dice, like in any capacity. And, I recognize that. So you might be a little confused about, like, hey, what's going on here? And the answer is, trust the process. We'll get there, I promise. Might have to rescind that promise later on, but you get the point. Right now, my biggest idea for how to incorporate the theme is genetic resequencing, which is a fancy word to say mutations. Mutations. So, this is kind of a fraught topic just because I'm not exactly sure how I want to do it yet. I have a lot of vague ideas that haven't really solidified into anything yet. But my main one at this point is, okay, so there's going to be different types of enemies in this game, swimming around with you, maybe walking on land, you drag them into the water, that kind of thing. And my idea is that each different enemy is going to have a trait, a stat associated with them. So, for example, you might have a waterlogged zombie, and that zombie's stat would be health. That would be the associated stat. You might have a really fast squid or an octopus or something like that, and its stat would be speed. You'd have maybe a pufferfish, and its stat would be size. Things like that, I think they're called cuttlefish. Cuttlefish? Yeah. I don't know. The maybe like an eel, a poisonous eel. That would be poison. You get the gist. And the idea is that each time you kill or eat, or maybe each time you get to a certain combo level with this enemy who has this associated stat, you roll a die. And whatever the outcome is, Rose's, your character's stat becomes that outcome. So let's say you find a fish, it's a really fast fish, its stat is speed. You eat that fish, you re-roll the die, and you get like a 4. So you've got like pretty much like a slightly above average speed. And maybe you kill that fish again later on, and you get like a 2. So it was a negative mutation, you got a downgrade. So the question is then, why engage with the combat at all? Why do any of this if, you're going to get to a point where it's like, okay, I have 6s and everything, or I have high, dice amounts. Why should I keep doing this? And my idea for that is permanent mutations. So basically, if you get a 6 in any of these stats from any of these enemies, you would get a permanent buff. Whether that be a special attack, or maybe a dash, or a short-term ability like being able to turn invisible or something. And these permanent upgrades would come with a visual change. So I've got one in Blender. This is how I make my models, by the way, Blender. And I'll come back to this. I'll talk about Blender later. But here we've got some barbed wire wrapped around her tail. And this might be one, if you get a 6 on strength, maybe you get a special super attack where she does a big spin, and you get this barbed wire on her tail, or maybe your attacks do bleed or something like that. You get what I'm saying. Or at least I hope you do. Anyways, so yeah, that's how I'm hoping to incorporate the theme, but God only knows if that's how it's going to end up happening. Nothing ever really survives the creative process, unscathed. So that idea might turn into something completely different. But, mutations are okay. That's kind of the whole theme of this game, this project. It's okay for things to change over time, even if those changes are sometimes for the worse. Anyways, try to think here if there's anything else about my ideas, anything we want to do. Yeah, enemies. I'll talk about enemies, because that's kind of my next step here in the process. I'll just do her idle animation in the background, something for you to look at. Though, I will say, hold on. This is going to annoy me if I don't set it up right. There we go. Enemies, enemies, enemies. I've got 2 ideas for enemies. One of them has to do with the spatial layout of the game, and the other has to do with yeah, they both have to do with the space, how I want to arrange the space in my game. So I'll talk about that first, actually. Because, you can see here we've got, she spawns above the water. We've got underwater, and then we've got the surface. You move around slower at the surface. It's obviously not set up properly right now. The bubble's going off into thin air. And you can move around fast underwater and, attack more quickly and that kind of stuff. And the idea here is that basically underwater is a free-for-all. It is a maelstrom of enemies attacking enemies and just stuff going crazy. You just have no idea what's going on. Like, you are constantly grappling with things and trying to reevaluate the situation. Meanwhile, outside of all that chaos, the surface is calm. It is above everything else, just orderly, gameplay-wise. And also visually, I'm thinking that below the surface there's, like, dust getting kicked up, particles flying all over the place, but above it, it is like a painting. It is just completely still. Maybe you hear crickets chirping, frogs, but that's it. It's just a totally still swamp. The water is placid. Love that word, placid. And that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be enemies, but just that the enemies would also be similarly predictable. So the idea I had was you have docks or boats with like hunters with guns and with flashlights on them. And they would do these very regular patrols, very predictable, that's kind of the whole point. You've got order and you've got chaos. And I like that because it ties into this, theme of like rolling the dice. Because to me that reads as like there's an innate like order versus chaos thing to that. It's like here we have this monster whose whole thing is that she is randomly mutating, and narratively it feels like it just feels natural to juxtapose that with perfect like perfect rigid order, perfectly predictable scenarios and visuals and stuff. So that's what I'm thinking. Yeah, and like I said, visually, aesthetically, it's also going to reflect that, not just in particle effects, but also like everything under the surface is going to be this kind of messy hodgepodge of just organic matter where, and my plan is for it to be this kind of like flooded city or base or something where there's like barbed wire and stuff. You see found houses that are just, excuse me, ew, sorry about that. You see houses that are just like covered by mud and algae and roots and vines. Like it is just I hate to swear in one of these videos, but a visual clusterfuck. Like just totally busy. And then compared to the surface, calm, easily readable. Like, anyways, you get what I'm trying to get at. And I already talked about one of my ideas for the enemies, which is the patrolling guys. And the other one, going with that chaos theme, is zombies, but not in the traditional sense. So the crux of this idea is that I want there to be this kind of constant ongoing battle underneath the surface. You are sort of a third party in this big underwater biological conflict that's going on. Because I feel like that is both, one, innately very chaotic, and two, not something that a lot of games explore. I feel like a lot of games, the onus of combat and conflict is on you, the player. And, it's kind of unique when you see something where it's like the player is just a third party that can intervene on something that's already ongoing. You see that. I feel like the example that comes to my mind is like Fallout 3 or Fallout New Vegas to a lesser extent, but mostly Fallout 3. Like the way the random encounters bleed into like towns, and like you might be wandering around and you find, I don't know, a bear or a dog or something that has half health, and you might move on a little further, and oh, lo and behold, there's some raider corpses here, and it's like you can infer from that, oh, there was a combat between these two enemies and I wasn't even there. Like, I love that stuff. I would think that's so interesting, and that's what I want to do here. And that is a long-winded way for me to talk about this idea that I have. Okay, so here's how it plays out. You have a bunch of corpses down here. You have these old bodies of like, in my mind, I thought of them as soldiers or police officers or guys in armor that are down here, just sitting here and decomposing beneath the waves. However, you have these types of like parasites, kind of like head crabs or face huggers or something in that ilk, that can kind of snake their way into these bodies and reanimate them, turn them into zombies. But there are multiple types of these parasites, and they are at war. And so it's this situation where you'll see a body that is reanimated by one species, and then it might get taken out, and another species goes into that body. It's like the bodies do not get destroyed, it's just the parasites inside them that get destroyed. So they're kind of using these corpses as almost like mechs to fight out this like biological conflict, this like dog eat dog like ecosystem, food chain war that's going on down here. And I just think that's fascinating. Like, I love that as an idea. I could talk about this forever, about how like its gameplay ramifications, you know, what it means to me personally, like just the visual of these two forces taking over the body of the same soldier and pulling it in two directions. Like, it speaks, sorry, I don't want to get into like the art stuff, but like it speaks to this universality of the body as like a vessel for conflict and for, you know, ideology or whatever it may be. But that's very theoretical. You know, all these ideas are very high scope, you know, pie in the sky ideas. Like, this is what I would do if I had all the budget in the world. And I have a week. So how do we square that circle? You know, how do we go from these crazy big ideas to having something that I can, you know, people can actually play in a week? And that is the question that I have not yet answered. You know, that's the question that I'm going to answer tonight after I finish this video, after I wrap it up. I'm going to sit down and do work. And we'll see where that takes me, and I'll probably make more of these videos in future. But yeah, no, that's everything with the game thus far. However, if you look down at the video's timecode, you will notice that it still has a way to go. And that's because from this point on, I'm going to be talking about 3D modeling and how to make cool stuff like this, like I do it. You know, how did I get to this point? How did I make this model in a day or two? So yeah, if you are just here for the game design stuff and just here to hear my update, then that's everything. See ya. I hope you have a great evening. But if you are one of the tortured souls that uses Blender or Maya or any art software on your computer and you want to learn how to make stuff like this, stay tuned. Because we're going to get into the weeds here. We're going to get into the weeds and the reeds and dive beneath them. So, how do you start the process of making a model like this? That's probably the first question that most people are going to ask me, and so I'm going to start with that. And the answer is sketches, the answer is drawings, and the answer is reference photos. Before I even started this model, I made some quick, you know, they're not great, but I made some quick sketches here in my notes, and I also had I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted her to look like, how I wanted her to move. You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about her, about Rose. And I also looked at some reference footage of, I looked up videos of people swimming and dogs swimming and alligators swimming. And you know, I tried to get a sense of how does an aquatic body move, you know. And I started with, as I usually do, I usually start with the feet, but in this particular project, I started with the head. And I turn on wireframe mode for the folks at home. No, that's too visually busy. I started out by basically carving her head out of, hold on, making a fool of myself here. I started with a sphere, and I basically just tinkered with that a bunch. You know, I extruded out the snout. I got up a reference image. It was actually an image of like a alligator fursuit head base. It was like a 3D printed base for fursuit. You know, I don't know, but I just found it Google Images, and it worked out perfectly. I popped that up in the background, and I basically traced it with the vertices here. And then I went crazy with the detail. You know, I expanded everything. I made it look decent in 3D. And there was a lot, and I mean a lot, of iteration. I really like how she turned out. Some of the notable things, I tried to go a lot more like angular, like less blobby with this model. You know, I tried to make it her kind of cartoony, you know. Her features are a little bit exaggerated. Like if you see here, her stomach is literally like 2 lines. Let me turn off the wire here, it's distracting. Like, there is a lot of her is just primitive shapes that are sort of meshed together. And the places where that isn't true are usually the joints. Like, for example, we have some, this is a little bit more complex here on the knees and on the armpits and like the shoulders and the neck and stuff. Let me get her hair out of the way. Her neck's her neck is the weakest part of it, but I don't really care because it's covered by hair all the time, so why bother? But yeah, I'm trying to think of what else I should talk about here. What would I want to hear if I was an aspiring 3D artist? Yeah, I feel like it's good. It's good to let kind of the art speak for itself and to let the 3D model like I feel like you can take a lot away just by looking at 3D topology. But yeah, there's a couple things of note here with rigging and stuff. Let me show you. So her hair is. Let me set this up. Sorry. I always get nervous when I'm making this kind of stuff. Messes me up. So her hair is actually like a lot of different bones that are connected to the same mesh, and they're using a damped track bone constraint, which is basically means that it's trying to point at the lowest one, which I find is a good way to make it so that you have this kind of, pretty good looking like wavy hair. And it's the same thing for, let me go here in 3D. It's the same thing for her bangs, though you don't see it as much because they're shorter. Or not her bangs, but like this right here, which drags her bangs around a bit. You don't want to make it go like that because she goes bald. But yeah, and for the tail too, I found that to be the best solution. I love the tail. It's probably my favorite part of the model. I also like the feet a lot, and I'm not a feet pervert or anything like that. I would be if I was. Anyways, that's totally like off topic. I don't know why I'm talking about that, but like I just feel like they're really well rendered, and I really like the way that they came out. I feel like they give such a good like mesh of, because I based them on werewolf legs. I think it was an image from American Werewolf in London, and that totally came through. Like they look like giant werewolf paws, but at the same time they're very recognizably like reptilian, and I love it because it's very clearly like a third thing. Like this is something new, mutated. Yeah. And I took a lot of inspirations here, kind of subconsciously, just without really thinking about it. There's a lot of Deathclaw in here, and I recognize that. I like to think that it's offset by the texture and the kind of the legs and the arms being more like human than a Deathclaw is, and that like. But there is definitely a lot of Deathclaw here. And she is also pretty similar to the Crowmen from Gloomwood, who I also love their design. Like her mouth is pretty similar to that. I was realizing when I was making this, but that ends up happening. You can't help that art inspires you, so don't overthink it. Nobody's gonna care, even if it was literally like one for one, practically the same design. Like, who's gonna come after you? This is your 3D model. You're making it in probably like in your basement. Like feds aren't gonna break down your door because you copied a 3D model from another video game. Professional studios do it all the time, so just don't worry about it. The moral implications, that's for you to deal with. But like, it's really not a big issue. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. She has IK on her hands and her feet, which works pretty well most of the time. Her feet are really hard to animate just because like this is a new creature, I don't know. It's hard to figure out how she moves. But besides that, it's not too terrible. Yeah, what else? There's a bit of clipping there. I could fix it, but it's like, I'll probably go in and fix it later. Let's talk about the texture. Texture is probably the coolest part of this model. It's definitely the best texture I've ever done. Like, just flat out. this is the coolest. And the way I make textures, I've talked about this in other videos, is through stencil painting. I could show you how I do that, but honestly, I feel like it would be easier just to talk about it. Because showing you, like, the process... Okay, I'll just show you, actually. You know, it's... I'm doing that thing I said not to do. I'm overthinking it. So we go in here. We get a texture. You know, I've got all my samples here. Some of these I use on the video. You probably see the... Anyways, yeah. So here's the kind of textures I have. You know, I got a bit of raw chicken. I use this inside her mouth. Got a lovely fishnet texture, some moss, trash. This guy. Here's the fursuit mask that I used for a base. Yeah. The barbed wire, some other textures, some random stuff. Yeah, and ooh, the SCP picture. I was inspired by this guy also. Let's just go for the fishnet here. This is a good example. So you go here, go texture. Oops, stencil. That's what we want. And look at that. We've got it. We can drag it around by holding right click. We can hold shift and right click to scale. And it's pretty simple. You will literally just draw on the texture like this. You know, I got it a little bit down there. And yeah, her texture is mirrored. So there's that. But it is exactly what it looks like. Like, it's really not that complex. You can also draw directly on the texture here, like this, which does work nicely for some things. For example, I was doing that with this moss texture. Oh, you can also turn this down, make it darker. You can also make it a little more green. I found the moss to be too bright. But yeah, like, this looks really cool when, if you can do it right. Doing this like here. You know, it's probably gonna look a bit weird because it's on her face, but whatever. Yeah, you can see how this works. It did look weird, I was right. Yeah, anyways. Is there anything else? Show you on the arms. See there. Yeah. The tail is probably my favorite. Like I said earlier, it just looks so, like, perfect. You've got bits of trash in there. It's held together with the fishnet texture, and it's all messy and mossy and scaly. Though I also like the thighs a lot. And the arms are also good. I like the fishnets at the edges of the arms. Gives her sort of a wife beater thing going on here. Yeah. That's Rose. That's pretty much everything. Yeah, the mouth is also obviously really cool looking. I love how it looks. And that was just with that little picture of that baby crocodile I showed up earlier, the little albino one. Turned out great. Trying to think if there's anything else to talk about here. I think that's about everything. If you have any questions, if you have any suggestions, please let me know. I love getting comments on these videos. I know I don't really respond to them, but trust me, I do read them. All 2 or 3 of them that I get. And yeah, I think that's everything. I look forward to, hopefully, publishing this game next week. And I'll probably make more of these videos in the process. Yeah, anyways, this has been Max. Peace.